Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Matt Stamper. I am a CISO and an executive advisor here at Evotech, and I am actually honored and thrilled to welcome you to Evotech's third annual Security Summit. These gatherings are inordinately important for all of us that work in security. Us security practitioners need these environments to be able to collaborate and share best practices and ideas. And I think the summit that Evotech has arranged for you today and tomorrow is certainly going to help. As we look back to 2021, we've had some very interesting challenges. In fact, Dr. Limbago's keynote will hit upon that. We've had challenges with respect to software that's been trusted that wasn't necessarily as trustworthy as ideal. Issues with components in a lot of the applications that we use, think Log4j, as well as the ongoing scourge and challenge of ransomware. So it's been a very interesting year. As we look into 2022, some of these challenges are obviously going to continue. So we have to start rethinking around how we look at our security programs, the security applications that we use. And as my friend and colleague Matt Schufelt will note, how we think about secure architecture, not security architecture. How we integrate and ingrain security from the very beginning when we're developing our enterprise architectures and the applications that run on top of those. So a lot of very important, unique challenges that we face. One of the things that I think is always important for us to do when we're in security is to kind of take pause and ask a handful of questions. What is it that we don't see that we should see, and why aren't we seeing it? What is it that we are not doing that we should be doing? And conversely, what are some of the things that we have been doing that we should probably no longer do? I think those are things that are really important, as well as what is it that I don't know that I should know about my security environment that will help make my organization more secure. As we look to our discussions and the topics coming into tomorrow, we're going to tackle a lot of those. We're going to talk a little bit about email security, SOC operations, some of the supply chain risk, which will clearly be part of our keynote in just a few minutes, as well as a number of other really, really interesting dynamics, including email security, infrastructure security, zero trust and SASE. So there's a really rich set of topics for us coming into tomorrow's discussions. And of course, following our keynote today, we are honored and literally thank them for our services to have a veteran panel that will be stewarded and led by a good friend, Emilio Escobar, as he'll talk to them about some of these veterans in cybersecurity. I am absolutely thrilled to introduce Dr. Andrea Little Limbago. Just to read a little bit from her bio, which is an exceptionally diverse and fascinating background. Dr. Limbago is a computational social scientist specializing in the intersection of technology, national security, and information security. Boy, if those things haven't come together, they certainly are. As the Vice President of Research and Analysis at Interos, Andrea leads the company's research and methodology regarding global supply chain risk with a focus on globalization, cybersecurity, and geopolitics. Andrea is a co-program director for the Emerging Tech and Cybersecurity program at the National Security Institute at George Mason, an industry advisory board member for the Data Science program at George Washington University, a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's GeoTech Center, and a board member for the Washington, D.C. chapter of Women in Security and Privacy, WISP. She has taught conflict studies in political economy and academia, was a technical lead at the Department of Defense, and has worked in several cybersecurity startups integrating social science fundamentals into analyses and models on attack trends, human-computer interaction, digital authoritarianism, security and privacy regulations, and security culture. Andrea earned a PhD in political science from the University of Colorado, and we have a huge contingent at Evotech from Colorado, obviously at the University of Colorado at Boulder, and a BA from Bowdoin College. So with that, I am absolutely thrilled to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Limbago. Welcome.
Hi, thanks so much. And thanks everyone for having me here. I'm very excited to be here presenting on some of the trends that I'm seeing. So hopefully everyone, is the slide sharing yet?
There it is.
There it is. Okay, I think that's going to be the best that we can do with the view. So with that, I'll go for it. Oh, it actually didn't even, is on the wrong slide. So always have the good technical difficulties to start with. We'll avoid those and start from the beginning. That's the best place to start. So we're talking about avoiding the data trap. And this is a new term that was just coined at the end of 2021. But it's one that, for me, really well defines what I've been seeing and sort of the trends I've been watching over the last, honestly, like over at least 5 years, even possibly going on into 10 years. And so I'll be talking about that. I'll be talking about reglobalization of the world, what that means, and why all that requires, all these transformations that are going on, why that requires us to rethink how we approach cyber risk. And so this is where the term data trap was coined, as far as I know. It was by British intelligence chief Richard Moore. And he's talking about, when talking about the data trap, he says, if you allow another country to gain access to really critical data about your society, over time that will erode your sovereignty. You no longer have control over that data. And what he's talking about really is from an intel perspective, and worried about losing control of governmental data and so forth to other governments. But this is super relevant for businesses and private sector as well, because the same concerns for governments maintaining other governments' data is the same thing about other foreign governments, or even your own government accessing and maintaining your own data, your own IP and your own PII. And that's the data trap. And how that actually comes together when thinking about supply chains is that for the average global brand, there are tens, if not hundreds of thousands of suppliers across hundreds, if not thousands of locations. So you can think about all the broad global footprint that companies have across the globe. Then you think about the various kinds of regulations that are at risk, the various kinds of attack risk that vary, location to location. And then when you think about your suppliers, you may be thinking about your immediate suppliers, and that may only be something across the area, could be in the hundreds. But then when you think about your second, third, fourth tier suppliers and that big web of your supply chain, it's across the globe. And so you want to make sure that you're not caught in that data trap where, whether it's your own footprint that might be global, or your supplier's footprint who has your data that might be global, and some of the regulations and the attack risks and the data risks in those locations. And so that's what we're going to be talking about over the course of this. And there was a really good discussion actually in the U.S. Congress, a great testimony that really highlighted, sort of the orthogonal trends, that all those benefits that companies get from information sharing, and from on the area of sharing IOCs, but really more so sharing just information and collaboration for product development and so forth. Everything that businesses need for that kind of collaboration are also the same ones that can lead to compromise of that organization. So when you think about all the information shared across your supply chain, and then where your supply chain is across the globe, it can be very, very risky. And so because of that, because of the vast amounts of information and data held by other companies across the globe, that's requiring a rethinking of how we think about supply chains and the data risks. And it by no means eliminates sort of the previous thinking about it. We still need to think about access controls, multi-factor authentication, all those kind of things. But we need to then now add on top of it yet another area of complexity into it. And that really is on sync with some of the complexity that we're seeing across the globe. And so what I want to talk about and end with is how can we avoid the data trap? And on the one hand, it may be very, very hard because you already have a footprint in areas that might be at risk. And so more so, how can we optimize those benefits from these changes that are underway, benefits from corporate collaboration, while still build resilience against some of these risks? And that's really what the focus will be on as well. It's how to focus on this resilience. And part of it is really understanding what is actually going on. And so before going into some of the solutions for this, I think it's useful to dive into a little bit of the problem set that's going on. And there really are these accelerated global transformations. And it's almost hard to understand. Matt mentioned that I have a political science background. So I look at international relations, and there's some core years that really stand out for when big shifts went on that led to just enormous restructuring of the global economy, of geopolitics, of trade flows, of human flows. Really every flow you can think of. And you think like 45 is a big one, 89, big one for recent ones. 2020 really was a big one and really leading to some major transformations. And that's why when we think about, sort of the disruptions that came along with COVID, what really happened was an acceleration of some underlying trends that were already there. But it is different. And that's where, if the the audience leaves with anything from this, it's that this time is different. We really do need to prepare for the new normal looking ahead as different from what was, what previous normal was. There are aspects of it that will continue into it, but we really need to rethink our resilience in looking ahead. And so what we saw with the COVID pandemic was that the decades of complexity from supply chains really led to a lack of visibility of who's connected to whom. Again, companies know very well their first tier supply chain, but they don't know the third, fourth, fifth party. And I'd even argue some may not necessarily know their first tier as well as they should, but all of that is starting to shift. But because of that complexity, because of the hyper specialization, because of the cost optimization and so forth, there is this opaqueness set in through our supply chains that really masked a lot of the vulnerabilities that existed within it. It also led to just huge concentration risks and bottlenecks. And this happens almost at every level, whether it's core choke points were surfaced, huge geographic concentration risks in China due to China's large growth of centers of last resort over the years. And then one that's perhaps most relevant for this audience is really the insecurity across supply chains really became paramount. And SolarWinds was just one of many over the last few years of digital supply chain risk that was exposed. And by no stretch of the imagination was it new, right? We look at NotPetya, for example. That was a huge aspect and one component of a supply chain attack. So this isn't anything that was new. And for all of these, what we really saw was a accumulation of all these trends really coming together. And with the shock of the COVID pandemic across the entire globe, it really showed this fragility in supply chains. And that's where a lot of companies now are trying to rebound and figure out how to create better resilience against these kind of vulnerabilities and fragility. And what also has become very apparent, again, not something that's brand new, something that's happened over time, is just that the value of data. And this was an Economist cover from several years ago, and it still rings true that data really is becoming the source of power, both for businesses and for governments. And this, again, is a very, very sharp shift. And I know it probably might seem like you're not necessarily as relevant within a cybersecurity audience, but I think it's really important to know that the way that data is viewed really is replacing in some regards, or at a minimum, it's augmenting the different kinds of power that is out there. In the past, what we really did for measuring power was looking at iron and steel production and military spending and so forth. And while some of that still matters for sure, the role of emerging technology and cybersecurity is really paramount, because what it does is it has an asymmetric nature where organizations or governments with much more smaller resources and much faster time can have a much broader impact. When you think about North Korea's cyber capabilities compared to how they would have been viewed 10, 20 years ago. And of course, nuclear components come along with that as well. But what we're seeing are countries like Vietnam having an APT linked to them, Lebanon having a global a group with global presence. And so we're seeing that smaller countries can have an outsized impact. And through all of that, really it's a quest of data, and data as a core asset. And that's where for businesses where it becomes very, very important, where it's this, the notion of the manipulation of the data, the protection of the data, the loss of the data has huge impacts across an entire business, from financial to reputational, even in some cases existential. And just due to the shifting nature of the big data environment, where there's huge speed, there's a huge amount of it. It comes in so many different sizes, and then just veracity, is it true or not? All of these are getting manipulated and taken advantage of under this quest for power. And so I think it's important to sort of rethink how we, the larger aspect of how groups and a lot of attackers, it becomes a power for them. It becomes whether they're doing it for finance or for reputation or for espionage. At the end of the day, it becomes a source of power and influence. And that's why we're starting to see two very different approaches to data from a government regulatory perspective. On the one hand, and this again, there's digital authoritarianism, which is one end of the spectrum, and I'll talk about digital democracies on the other. These are basically large-scale views of what these are. Governments tend to fall somewhere along the spectrum between these, but for digital authoritarianism at its core, the focus really is on how to leverage technologies and data to surveil, repress, and manipulate their own population. And what we're increasingly seeing is that once they test out these tactics domestically, they then are applied to foreign populations. And we've seen that in the United States quite a bit. And importantly, it's not, I know we hear a lot about Russia's interference, for instance, and disinformation, but it really does extend well beyond it. I mean, we heard, very much so, information about Iran and some of the Iranian groups getting involved, Chinese manipulation of the data. I mean, we also see domestic sources who are manipulating data, and so it becomes, this broad range of tactics where for authoritarian regimes, specifically focusing on governments, their freedom of information threatens their political survival, and that's how they view that. And so this, again, becomes a tool of power to control that data. Now, conversely, for digital democracies, it's a much more nascent concept. We really have seen over the last decade, governments have done a remarkable job actually innovating in the realm of digital authoritarianism. That same kind of innovation has not followed through for digital democracies. And actually, for the most part, there was still, holding on to the mindset that, free and open internet will win for all. We saw it very much so after the Arab Spring, when in reality, governments actually from that learned the lesson to try and take greater control, especially the authoritarian governments. And so a digital democracy really is an aspirational vision. I would argue no government has reached the level of these. But I do think that that aspirational vision becomes very, very important, because absent that vision, and we've seen this, absent a coherent democratic playbook to counter the digital authoritarianism, the digital authoritarianism basically becomes the playbook of choice. And so it's really important to have this aspirational vision of a secure and trusted internet. It does require very much so multi-stakeholder international cooperation. And we are starting to see some areas of that starting to take root over the last year or two, which I think is a welcome change. We're starting to see some policies that are more so focused on addressing greater security and privacy. And under these kind of regimes, the freedom of information is a universal right. So it's not a threat to regime survival, but it actually reinforces it and is viewed as a human right. And that falls in the lines with the UN just passed something recently as far as access to the internet as a universal right. And for the most part, governments fall somewhere in between. And because of that, because of these absolutely orthogonal approaches to dealing with data and information and technology, we are seeing the global splintering of the internet at the same time as growing interdependence in other areas. And so we're seeing these contrasting trends going on that really just hit head on. And it's not necessarily just in the area of how the digital authoritarianism tactics and the digital democracies. We're seeing it really play out in a range of areas as far as competing forces. And so what I'd like to do is just spend a little bit of time highlighting some of the competing forces that may not necessarily be on your radar. So the first one, we'll look at internet blackouts versus internet expansion. And if anyone has been following what's going on in Kazakhstan, internet blackouts were a core part of the government's attempt to control information and subdue some of the unrest and the protests going on there. But internet blackouts have increased 6,000% over the last decade, really. They cause billions of dollars in damage. They've been used across the globe, and it's not just authoritarian. And that, again, is another reason why the tactics that are deployed by digital authoritarianism do at times get deployed as well by democracies, which is yet another reason to be concerned about those tactics and that model gaining traction across the globe, is because it is influencing and contributing to a broader decline of democracy across the globe. But for the most part, it is the democracies or the authoritarian regimes that are deploying that. And so the most recent, timely, is Kazakhstan over the last week or two, Sudan as well over the last few weeks as well. And what you've seen as well, though, is that the Indonesian court is actually, democracy ruling in favor of blocking the internet to control unrest. And so again, that's sort of a competing force going on in a democracy, having the lack of access to information. But these are really just becoming much more prevalent, and is something to be on the radar, especially when you think about accessing your data in some of these areas. The same thing about Kazakhstan was it influenced the cryptocurrency market for crypto mining. So it does impact different markets in different ways that may not actually have been foreseen. Separately, we're seeing the internet as a great accelerator. And why this is so important is that there's just a very, very remarkable correlation between economic development and internet access and access to information and basically overall economic development. And COVID was a huge accelerator for that, 17% bump in users over the last 2 years, which is amazing. It's twice the population of the US. So it's a lot more people have come online, but we still have, roughly 3 billion that haven't used the internet, but that is slowly starting to decrease. And so we'll see what happens with that. So we'll have the blackouts going on at the same time as extended access to information two very different and opposing trends that are underway. And back to the notion of supply chains, we're really seeing, probably don't need to discuss that with this audience, but huge amount of supply chain manipulation. We're seeing that on the rise, but we're also seeing the notion of trusted networks. So again, we're seeing sort of the weaknesses that could emerge through interdependence, but also the benefits that can emerge through interdependence. With supply chain attacks, this is just the list, and the bullets are from MITRE. And along with that is it's a whole range of attacks. It could be everything from an update of a source code, open source updates, to manipulation of hardware, to something like shipment interdiction. So it is a very, very broad range of tactics that can be deployed that fall under their umbrella of supply chain attacks. And these attacks have been increasing 650% by one account in 2021. And that was even before some like what Matt mentioned, the Log4j vulnerability was released or was announced. And so the supply chain attacks are starting to get a lot more notice. They're becoming a lot more formalized within the broader community's analysis of them. But they really, it's important to know they just take on a really wide range. And what makes them so tricky is that it could be, it's legitimate software very often, and just folks following perceive what's a good cyber hygiene for updating their system. That could be the way that it actually ends up getting distributed, such as a CCleaner attack from a few years ago. And so while the interdependencies create a vulnerability, the interdependencies also are creating really a good way to maintain better resilience. And what I think I'm optimistic about with the trusted networks effects is this focus on the different ways that interdependence and collaboration across groups can lead to greater security. And breaking it down into what we like to think about as people, processes, and technology. On the people side, we're seeing it quite a bit, as far as the United States is issuing a lot of regulations as far as certain people or companies from being allowed to be within a supply chain. For instance, I would say people/organizations on that. There are about 350, if not more at this point, Chinese companies that have been that are not allowed to be in U.S. supply chains due to commerce regulations. And so we're seeing that happen. But then at the same time, highlighting who are some of those trusted suppliers, who are some of the trusted organizations that can be in your network. And I think we're going to see some more discussion along those lines and some more movement in that area. On the processes, we're starting to see some global alliances and partnerships. And so a lot of these are really not focusing as much as on the exclusion of certain groups, but really on who to integrate, who is trusted, and how to figure out who that might be. And everything from the software bill of materials, which is really starting to gain quite a bit of traction to address what are the core components, the libraries, the software, and so forth that are in a product or within a company's ecosystem. We're seeing new regulations and policy shifts. We saw after the Summit of the Democracies, several democracies coming together to focus together on export controls and to collaborate in areas of certain technology-focused areas. And then just more enhanced vendor compliance and security screening. And so these are helping create more of a trusted notion within a company's network. And then with technology, I spoke to some of those, but it is, before where it was, a bit more of the free market and any company can come in, there's just going to be greater scrutiny on this. And that's because of the dual use nature of technology. I think that's the reality for so many of these technologies. And so the focus will be on how can you secure the software? How can you do joint research and development that fosters collaboration while minimizing some of the risks of some of that innovation. And then finally, another one that I'm tracking is government mandated data access versus the data privacy and federal data protection. And I do think this is one that's not quite as much on the radar for a lot of people as perhaps it should be. And this is where, again, you can think about the different regulatory policies of governments really providing a new risk that I think doesn't often fall on the radar. And so I'll talk about those briefly. And so for the governments that are mandating data, what you're seeing along the lines is it's everything from to have a company within a certain sovereign area, you have to form some sort of joint venture with a company. So you get something along those lines, which then can put your data, access immediately at risk. Or it could be something even more straightforward, where the price for access to a market, price for access to an economic market, is the risk that you may have to turn over your data upon request. And that's very similar to China's new data privacy and security laws, but it's not just there. And I think that's sort of the important thing to think about. Vietnam, Cambodia, and some other countries are starting to focus more on this notion of data access by the government for having access to their market. And so that kind of falls along the lines of the data residency risks, where data storage becomes a requirement, domestic data storage. So if you're a company and you're operating in a certain country and they've got data residency requirements, then you're required to store your data there. And these kind of laws really should influence security experts and security leaders on how they think about their data minimization strategy, access controls, and so forth, because it can become a very big risk. And so on top of those are also that source code disclosure. We saw that with Russia demanding some source code. But we're also seeing the data that can be acquired just through surveillance and tech infrastructure that may be put into buildings of suppliers across the globe. And then taking it even a step further, while I think we're probably well aware of different governments that leverage various kinds of cyber capabilities for espionage, we're also seeing governments across the globe purchasing spyware from private sector companies. And Facebook actually put out an article on this fairly recently, but Citizen Lab has been tracking it for quite some time. Atlantic Council just put out fairly recently articles on this. So if anyone's interested, there's a lot more research starting to pop up along these lines. But the notion of hacking for hire falls back into that notion that due to the asymmetric nature of cyber tech capabilities and technology, that a lot of capabilities that once were the domain of governments and of only a handful of governments now can be purchased from private sector companies. And this is an area actually where we see some of the interaction of what I was talking about before, where a company like NSO Group was recently put on one of the restriction lists by the US government. And so companies are not allowed to have certain kinds of relationships with NSO Group now that they're on that list. And it's because of the spyware component that they bring. And so I think that area gets a lot of focus, and understandably, there's a lot of risk to go along with it. There's also big movements toward data protection. And it's, GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, is really the one that's been driving, I'd say, the thought leadership across the globe. It's inherited that it's created, inspired probably more copycats than any other data protection law across the globe. Brazil's recent laws, one case, California's CCPA. And in each of those cases, while they're not identical to GDPR, they build upon it. And the GDPR has provided really a very solid counterweight to how to approach data and individual data rights in comparison to more of the digital authoritarian model. And that's not to say there aren't issues or it doesn't need to evolve, but it is providing that counterweight that prior to that was absent. And in Africa, we're seeing almost half their countries have formed some sort of data protection law. So it's not it's not a regionally focused idea. This is something that it's caught on globally. And so given all this, and given all these competing forces, given that the splintering of the internet, where your experience in safety within one country is going to be different from where it is in another, how can we start thinking about building some sort of resilience against this data trap and how to avoid that data trap? So a couple areas to think about, and almost the flip side of some of the vulnerabilities and fragility that I highlighted earlier. Focus on the insights. How can you look both for alternative sources and suppliers across your extended supply chain, but test out some various kinds of scenarios and so forth to help optimize that resilience, and think about just much broadly what information, what kind of risks might be there, which requires that visibility. And that's where it becomes, those are very much intertwined. And that gaining visibility almost would be that very first step. If you're not sure who your first tier suppliers are, that'd be step number one. But then beyond there, think about who are their suppliers, where are their suppliers, and then what does that look like? Are there different concentrations? And are those concentrations in areas where data is much more so at risk? And that's one area to think about, even on top of just looking as well as at those companies, their own security postures and their own security behavior, even if they are in a more secure area of the world. And that's where diversification can come in to actually help eliminate some of these geographic dependencies and eliminate some of the choke points. Then just the notion that I really want to, I'm going to harp on hopefully throughout the rest of this year, is this notion of collective resilience. I really think that we've been approaching security for so long from our own view, whether it was from the castle of moat for a while, and then to the perimeter is dead, and then really we need to expand it out into we're only as secure as our partners are as well. And so what can we do to help raise the security of all of our partners in collaboration, and not necessarily even with our business partners, but across industries, we're seeing some good information sharing happening there. But really, with like-minded partners who similarly want to build greater resilience and help build that vision of the internet that can help provide greater security and prosperity for most of society. And so to do that, a lot of it for me always goes back to the fundamentals. And I think this is probably true, I think, for a lot of us. When we think about, if we can just get the fundamentals done, that'd get us 95% of the way there in protecting against so many of the threats. And so when you're thinking about the fundamentals for your supply chain risk and your global presence, that who becomes that visibility, that it becomes so important, just knowing who you're partnered with, where's your data going, who has access to it, and in addition to where is it located. And that where becomes very, very important as well for those reasons that I talked about a little bit earlier. The what gets back to both what data is it that different folks have access to, but also what technologies, what products also are in your supply chain that might cause risk. And so that's something that I think we need to increasingly think about. We hear about so many of these trusted products that could be in your supply chain that then have a vulnerability, but also just thinking about other kinds of products that just might pose a risk due to their data collection processes, for instance. And then think about the why of what's going on. Why, if there a disruption happens, really try and find a root cause. Take the time to do the root cause analysis, and I think that helps provide both the planning component that's going to be necessary, but even trying to look at that ahead of time to prepare for when some sort of disruption happens, and look about why an attacker may go after certain kinds of data, why a certain product might be more risky, why a certain government might be, our country for a location might be riskier. Really, push the envelope on those, and then everything becomes very, very timely as well. And so that's being able to identify when a disruption might happen and how to respond to that becomes very important, so that you're not always so reactive. And so these are just really the fundamentals in thinking about how to build the resilience, but they're very hard. I think as we know, it's much easier said than done. And so in this transformed world, as we're moving towards this enormous transformation with the reglobalization, with trade flows starting to shift, with reshoring, onshoring, and so forth of supply chains, with the technology and technological resilience, I think it's good to highlight just some positive collective measures that are going on across the globe that I would argue are fairly new. Again, we focus a long time on the attacker, and on offense, and I think that still requires a lot of attention. But really getting to innovation and defense, and especially defense together, I think is really, we're going to see a lot of interesting innovation starting to occur. So I'm excited to see that over the next few years. And a lot of this collaboration is driven by market pressures, as well as this ongoing threats in the regulatory environments. And so it's almost this perfect storm that's coming together to encourage collective resilience against these threats, to help encourage greater collaboration and secure across the ecosystem. So not just securing your own perimeter, but also helping secure your suppliers. One good example that I've had that I'd love to talk more about what other people are doing is that within one company, for a lot of the suppliers, there's the cyber poverty line. They basically can't afford to have some of the enormous SOC teams and all the various kinds of products in within their organization. And so the main supplier may help do some red teaming, may help provide some additional security assistance to some of their core suppliers. And that's the kind of collaboration that I think we need to start seeing more of, to recognize that we are all in this together. And so first, just to start with sort of the where the world really is going and how the future is now, we're seeing these orthogonal forces, the bifurcation going on already in undersea water cables. China's building their infrastructure, but we're also seeing collaboration on the other side of the U.S., Australia, and Japan creating their own undersea cables as well, which I think is just an interesting way to see that it's not just above the ground and in the internet, but also we're seeing the undersea cables, and this all gets back to where's the data flowing through. We also saw fairly recently was the IMF leading a 10-country simulation attack, basically a war game of what would happen to a global attack on the financial system. Again, this is the kind of preparation that I think is just so important. And one hand, at least for me, I would have thought that this may have been something that had been done, at least a decade ago, but there really hasn't been a lot of collaboration, especially cross-country collaboration, and certainly not at the international governmental organization level. And I think this is really interesting. I'll be curious to see more, how much more comes from this. We're also seeing it within the EU. Again, one of the leaders in collaborative security, looking at creating they have a European alliance for data edge in the cloud. And I think these kind of alliances, again, are going to be things that we're seeing popping up. I do think it's interesting to note that there's 39 companies, so it's a good private public sector story, but does not have any Chinese or US companies amongst this alliance. And that's, we're seeing, different forms of collaboration are popping up across the globe. I would also like seeing are sort of in the open source side, really leveraging that the security community, leveraging innovation and collaboration to create. Then these are just a handful of those, but ways to look at and help inform software security and how to test that, and making that open source. And I think, again, this is the more we can see the private sector coming into play and doing their part in helping secure supply chains for everyone, I think the better off we are. So it's exciting to see some of these different projects pop up, and I'll be curious to see, how well they do and as these evolve over the next few years. And this Defenders Against Log4j, again, Log4j is still ongoing. We're still trying to assess, as a community, the broader impact of it. But what we quickly saw was on Twitter from various governments and from defenders providing that list of products that may be using Log4j. And so just providing that kind of information, which gets back to that notion of insights, providing that information, making it readily accessible for everyone, helps raise the bar helps raise the security level for everyone. And that collaboration really is just super essential. And so when looking ahead, we were seeing these major transformations underway. What can you do as a company to help avoid the data trap? And so I think probably the first thing really, I kind of went more tactical earlier for some of the different steps to take, but it really is essential to take note that the policies that are getting shaped right now, across the globe, are focused on the collection, control, movement, and protection, and access to data. And these are already having enormous societal effects, and they'll continue to have enormous societal effects, really shaping every aspect of the future. And so while they're focused much more so, in the digital world, they're having very much, that they propagate throughout the real world for everything from civil liberties to economic flows of data and cross-border flows of goods and services. So it's really impacting every aspect of life. And that change is coming very fast. This was just a handful of ones from over the last few months, probably close to a year now for some of them. You had Hungary suspending aspects of the GDPR, but at the same time, you see Ecuador approving a data protection law. And again, these opposing forces all coming into play that are really making it hard to protect your data abroad and to stay on top of that. But it's just also just a shifting regulatory environment that is really, really, really dynamic. But with all of that and with some of those challenges, there are plenty of opportunities for the private sector and public sector as well. One, you're thinking about resilience as a competitive advantage. I think that's sort of the thing to focus on. The question I always get asked is, well, it's going to cost a lot of money up front. And for some cases it will. For many of these companies, they can afford it. And for those that can't, that's where sort of the notion of collective resilience comes in. But it's like any investment where the preparation and acknowledging that these disruptions are coming, I think those that are preparing for that now are really it's going to pay dividends down the road. And I'll say, fortunately, there's a lot going on in the technology world that really can help overcome some of the blind spots that are out there. And so really, Matt talked about, do a lot of human-computer interaction, but really making it easy and accessible to look at your supply chain, explore it, getting alerts in real time to what's going on across the globe so you can figure out how to respond. I think technology is going to really help us solve some of these problems, both for that visibility, but also for information sharing, collective defense, and so forth. And with that, it becomes a increasing reliance in hopefully support for building trustworthy networks. And so within that notion, both across the people, processes, and technology, really looking at what data might be at risk by product, and looking at how it might be by company, by the regulatory environment. So data at risk really should look at all the different levels of analysis, and then sort of the reverse of where is data protected, which products protect it best, which companies are protecting their data best, and which environments are protecting it best. And by working together, we hear so much about the weakest link being the third party that's out there that you may be secure, but the weakest link is a way to come into your network. By focusing on this collective resilience notion, we really can avoid that collective weakest link problem. And if not avoid, at least minimize it, I should say, as best as possible. But all this is underway now. And so it's, we're at a point where we can't look backwards. We can build upon what has happened in the past, bring along the learnings. But we are, this is the future that's underway now. It's not a new Cold War. It's not a demise of globalization. It's a brand new environment. The technology is shifting everything. And along with that, we need to, not forget, but the aspects of cyber risk that we've taken so far, but we really just need to evolve our imagination and how we think about cyber risk and how to protect our data in wherever it goes, across the globe. With that, I will stop sharing this and go to Matt.
A testament of our time. So first
exactly.
and foremost, Dr. Limbago, absolutely phenomenal discussion. And I think you gave me one of the most interesting coins of phrase that I've heard in recent years, which is simply a cyber poverty line, and really thinking through the implications for those organizations that may be suppliers, vendors, secondary, tertiary levels, and the like, and the obligations of those that are perhaps better equipped, more resourced to support that. So I think that's going to be something truly phenomenal to watch.
And I will say, Wendy Nather coined that at Cisco when she was at Duo. Wendy Nather, when she was at Duo, first coined. So I'm going to give it. That wasn't my own. I'm not that creative. So it was all her.
I love that line. Absolutely.
No, it's amazing. And I think it's something that we don't think about much. And it does. Well, I think it's resonated fairly well. The more that we can sort of help amplify that message, because then it gets back to that not everyone is a resource, and that it could. We so often wonder, well, why didn't they just patch? Why didn't they just do this? And they may not have the resources or the ability to do so. And so what can we do, or what can anyone with resources do to help others? And I think that's really the message.
I guess giving new meaning to trickle down. Bad joke. One of the things that we see in cybersecurity is this issue of accountability. Who owns which types of risks, things of that nature. I would really love to learn a little bit from your insights at Interos and just some of the impressive work that you and your extended team are doing. When you think about supply chain and vendor risk, who should own that within the organization? Who should be at the table? What does an ideal team look like from your perspective?
Yeah, on the one hand, I'd almost argue there's not one single, because everyone's situation is a little bit different. And that's where, it can depend on the resources, how big your team is, and so forth. But where it's starting to fall more and more under CISOs to look at the broader risk, which I think is interesting. So for some of the major companies, there's a procurement component. There might be some regulatory component that comes under a chief privacy officer. But we're seeing the CISOs really almost becoming, in many cases, a chief risk officer as well. Again, as if there wasn't enough for CISOs already to do. Now it's putting on even more, because so much of it becomes the digital supply chain becomes a core component of it. But also just tracking where your data is going through suppliers. Both of those are almost naturally making it nest under a CISO as well. And so for other organizations that are really, really big, and they may have their own chief risk officer, and they can work together. Or unfortunately, what we still see is a bit of a piecemeal component to it. So you've got one part of an organization who's looking for suppliers for things may not think about the security component of it at all. Yeah. And that's where you need to have the communication. So even if you don't have it all centralized in an area, which it becomes very hard for some companies, absent that centralization, that's where the communication becomes so important, because those who are in procurement and looking at which suppliers to buy, or looking to whether they want to renew a contract, really need to ensure the security component is an aspect of that assessment.
Yeah, and I think moving to a more proactive approach to this is critical, because too often security is kind of after the fact. By the way, we just acquired this company, or we entered this relationship with this firm. There's the legal risk, there's the financial and supply side risk, there's obviously clearly the security risk. As you look back in just all of your experiences, and you start thinking about ways that the supply chain has been compromised or made less resilient, maybe outline one or two of the more novel things that you've seen that would have all of us going, oh crap, I should have thought about that.
Yeah, on one hand, that's hard, because I feel like this audience is pretty well aware of the fish tank attacks and some of those that are like, what? How'd that happen? I think it goes back into, it's almost sort of the intrusions into what should be normal and what you think is, that is almost contradicts good cyber hygiene. So it is when, the updating of aspects of it. But I think also really having a good, itemization of all the various kinds of software, which is in a company. Very often what happens with some of these supply chain attacks, like, oh, we don't have that in our system, we're fine. Then it turns out, oh, actually we do. And maybe it's not directly your company, or maybe it's a subsidiary that has it within their network, or maybe it's a supplier who does. And through that, though, that your data could become compromised. And so I think that really looking sort of broadly at, oh, my data, we have nothing to do with that product or that software, but it turns out that you do, because someone who holds your data has access to that. So I think that might be the biggest one. But it is when you're thinking about just updates, like software updates seem like a good thing to do. We advise everyone to do that, and then at times that can be compromised. So it's hard. It's really hard at this point. But again, that's where I think the information sharing can come into play, in working together, both internally within your own company to make sure everyone's aware of what's going on, then as well as the partners that you have.
And maybe just briefly, the fish tank attack.
Now that you're gaining access to because all the smart, it's IoT, right? So it's gaining access through a fish tank that happened to be a smart fish tank. I almost can think about it. The smokers, the smoker grills are becoming very popular, and some of those are now are smart. They're the really nice ones are smart and made with Bluetooth. And I'm just waiting for the smoker attack to happen next. Maybe that's my 2022 prediction.
Exactly. Well, Dr. Limbago, I just can't thank you enough and your extended team at Interos for the insights today. I know in the comments on the other channel there that the feedback has just been phenomenal. And I think you've opened our eyes for those of us that kind of carry the CISO bag, just how complicated supply chain and vendor risk management, they are distinct, but just how complicated those efforts are, and how we really do need to retool. In that spirit of transformation, supply chain risk of 2010 is very different compared to supply chain risk in 2022. Yeah, so thank you again for an absolutely astounding discussion.
No, thanks so much for having me. It was fun.
Excellent. In just a few moments, we're going to continue. We will have our veterans from cybersecurity joining us in just a little bit. So if everybody wants to take just a moment or two and grab a glass of water or whatever they need, we'll be right back. Thank you guys again for being here.